We continue our study of God's plumb line using as our theme text Amos 7, verses 7 and 8. This is what he showed me. Behold, the Lord was standing beside a wall built with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. We find in this passage the Lord described as a builder. And this is a common image throughout Scripture, but in this passage in particular, we find the Lord using a plumb line not only in the construction of a wall, but in the assessment of that wall. In just that way, we find that God, in his holiness, is providing standards for us in the building of our lives as Christians and in the assessment of how we are doing. Now, there are many ways in which God has provided us with guidance, with standards, but all of these reflect back to the perfect standard of God's own holiness. Let's consider in this lesson the plumb line of civil society. Whenever we think about the broader culture, whether you're talking about the arts or the sciences or various civic endeavors, of athletics, of social concourse that we would have, the relations that we sustain in our neighborhoods and communities, the standards that we find in the schoolroom and through government. We find in all of these things certain standards being put forward. Now, in looking at these standards, there is a need for balance. This, more than any other, is a very mixed bag because we cannot uncritically accept the world's judgments. We recognize that because sin entered the world in its fallen state is always corrupted. As John writes in his first epistle, chapter 5, verse 19, we know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. The whole world, everything that we see has been touched with sin. And as a result, the kingdom of this world is not at this time the kingdom of our Lord. Because of this, the judgments that are rendered in secular society will always, to some extent, be contrary to the will of God. The book of Romans describes this in very great detail. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul goes through a listing of various sins, figuring, by the way, very prominently the sin of male homosexuality and of lesbianism and its unnatural offense to God. And going through all of the sins that are listed, various moral depravities, the apostle sums up in this statement. Verse 32 of Romans 1, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. The world is disordered. And for that reason, even though they have, through natural law, the tools at their disposal to understand the major tenets of the moral law, they disregard that. And they not only do abominable things, but they give approval. They set up a standard that approves those who practice this sinful way. Now, as Christians, We must be very careful that we do not permit the standards of the world to corrupt us. We're warned in the book of Proverbs, chapter 25, verse 26, like a muddied spring or a polluted fountain is a righteous man who gives way before the wicked. There are times when we must stand with our integrity. And when the world is pushing us in a way that is ungodly, if we give way, then we are polluted. We are compromised. We are not what we ought to be. There is no excuse that because the world tells us to do something, that we should do that uncritically. This is even in reference to the civil authorities. In Acts chapter 5, we find the apostles being commanded not to teach the gospel, not to teach about Jesus Christ. Their response, recorded in Acts 5:29, but Peter and the apostles answered, "We must obey God rather than men." So even if the government tells you to do something that is ungodly, you must not do it. The fact that it is legal does not mean it is moral. The fact that the government requires it does not mean you should do it if it is contrary to the will of God. Now, in spite of the world's wickedness, God's judgments are seen in the standards that are embraced in society. We can look at all manner of pagan and ungodly societies, and we can always find some element of righteousness, some element of holiness that is there. Now, very quickly, I will add that those societies that are informed and directed and shaped by the Bible are radically better. They are ennobled. But even in the most depraved of pagan societies, you will find some understanding of the divine standard. This is inescapable because all men and women are made in the image of God. For that reason, they tend to have an understanding of divine perfection. In Philippians 4, verse 8, we read, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things." Going through this list, we find an underlying assumption that there are standards, that there are things that are excellent, and these things are understandable by human beings. That's why they are worthy of praise. The categories of things that are beautiful, the things that are lovely, the things that are right, these categories, however distorted they may be in secular society, are still there and give us a place where we can talk with the world around us and that we can use to assess our own lives. Proverbs 22, verse 1, "A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold." What society thinks about you matters. Now, it does not matter as much as what God thinks about you. And yes, you should obey God rather than men. But to the extent that you are able to look to the opinion of society, to have a good reputation, this is something you should strive for. Romans 12:17, "Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all." what is honorable in the sight of all, we need to be very careful that we do not willingly give offense. Now, there are times when, holding on to our Christian virtues, we must be offensive to the secular world. When the secular world tells us that deviant sex is something to be proud of, and they establish Pride Month for the very purpose of elevating all manner of deviance to something that should be admired, we have to resist that, even though it makes us offensive to those around us. But where we are able to avoid giving offense, where we are able to do what is honorable in the sight of all, we should be doing that. As an example, our society has embraced the idea of tobacco use as being unclean, of being dirty and wrong. Now, I know of many people who do not share that conviction. But as a Christian, there is no reason you ought to be offensive to a wide swath of people. No one will look down on you if you don't smoke. There are many who will look down on you if you do. In the same way, in environmental matters, there are many who will look down on you if you do not recycle. Now, in many localities, the materials that are put into recycling are thrown into the exact same landfill as the materials put in the regular trash, because the municipality does not have the facility for recycling. And yet people still do this as a form of virtue signaling. Virtue signaling, if it is hypocrisy, should be avoided, of course. And virtue signaling, whenever it is advancing a lie, should be avoided. But going through the niceties of popular culture, that which is honorable in the sight of all, is something that we ought to do. The same thought is found in 2 Corinthians 8:21. For we aim at what is honorable, not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. Now, as we look at the broader culture, we recognize that there are times where the broader culture is leading us into a point that is wrong. Think back to the early to mid 20th century. And in most of the southern United States, the dominant culture was providing a very twisted and sinful view of race. We find that the dominant culture shifted as the 20th century wore on. And today, the dominant culture says you should not be a racist. Now, we could argue as to how appropriately that is applied, how consistently that is applied in various areas. But the ideal, the standard of not being prejudiced against someone because of their ethnic background, because of their racial composition, that is something that we should embrace, because indeed, that is in alignment with the will of God. In the realm of sexual morality, as I've already mentioned, our society is very, very askew. But still, most people have at least some standards. And these standards help us to see the standard of God. This was true in the first century. In the Corinthian church, there was sexual immorality. And in condemning this, the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not tolerated even among pagans, for a man has his father's wife. The Lord's church should have a higher standard of morality than the world around us does. But where secular society has standards, at the very least, we should be following those standards. Further, our reputation to the outside helps us to assess what kind of people we really are. This is true in the selection of elders. 1 Timothy 3, verse 7, in listing the qualifications, Paul tells Timothy, moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. An elder in the Lord's church needs to be someone who is well thought of, not only in the church, but by outsiders. And it's interesting. It tells us that if he is not, he is in danger of falling into the snare of the devil, that he will be a disgrace. A leader in the church must not be uncouth. A leader in the Lord's church must not be offensive needlessly to the broader society. And if he is, by advancing him in leadership in the church, we are not doing him any favor, for he will be falling into a snare of the devil. We find God's judgment revealed in civil government. Now, I want to emphasize, whenever we talk about government, we in the United States have a very slanted view because we are a representative republic. And historically, this is a very new thing. We were the first large-scale republic to be found on Earth. Further, even the newness of it is not the only unusual characteristic, but also throughout the entire world, most people have not had control over their government. Now, in the first century, essentially no one thought in terms of a participatory government, that the government was controlled by the people. The Roman Empire was a top-down organization. But in this setting, which was ruled by pagans, many of whom were very depraved individuals, we find the Apostle Paul telling us in Romans 13, verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Now, we look back and we see the caveats I've already laid out, that civil society is disordered. And in particular, that whenever the government tells you to do something that is wrong, you cannot obey the government. And yet, that doesn't change the truth that the government exists by the authority of God. And for that reason, we need to take very seriously our obedience to that government. Paul goes on and is more pointed. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger, who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. We look at this and we find just the government described as God's servant. Again, remember, this was written at a time when one of the most notably depraved emperors was on the throne. Nero, who would eventually, in not very many years after this, have both Peter and Paul put to death and would be responsible for the torture of many Christians. He is described here and his administration as God's servants. We have to recognize that even if the government is peopled by very ungodly men and women, that there is an obedience they are owed. Verse 5, therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Now, there are many practical applications of this. The Apostle Paul turns most pointedly to the question of paying taxes. People have always resisted paying taxes, and yet God's people are supposed to pay what they owe. Verse 6, for because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Especially in the past few years in America, I have become concerned with the lack of respect that is shown to government officials. And this is true across the political spectrum. President Biden deserves to be respected as president. President Trump should be respected as a former president. They should not be described in derisive ways that demean the office. This does not mean that we have to acquiesce to them, and we need to emphasize that in the American system, the ultimate sovereign is the people. Citizens are over the government. For that reason, it is not wrong to resist within the framework that is set up. It's not wrong to work to overturn laws that we don't like. It's not wrong to lobby for more spending on something or lower taxes at times. It's not wrong to engage in the public square, but we must do so respectfully, and we must do so recognizing that the authority of government is God-given. There has to be a balanced view. In this, we must take to heart what Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, but test everything, hold fast what is good. In looking at civil society, whether we're talking about the arts or academia, the sciences, the corporate world, the social interactions we have with our neighbors, popular opinion on this, that, or the other, or of government mandates and direction, we are to be good stewards, which means when society, in any of its manifestations, is laying out a standard, It deserves to be considered. We need to test it, but we need to test it according to God's perfect standard. The only perfect standard is the Lord himself. All the other plumb lines that are given in a derivative sense from the Lord. In each of these, we're able to see things that will guide us, that will help us, that will strengthen us in our service. But if at any time, any of the plumb lines we've been looking at, any of the standards that have been given are contrary to the holiness of God, then we must say, let God be true, even though every man is a liar. The only perfect standard is the Lord himself, and this is true considering the plumb line of civil society. It's a blessing to have input from the secular world. From every aspect of the secular world, it is something we should be engaged in. We should be considering the messages that are put forward, but we need to do so always recognizing the ultimate plumb line, the ultimate standard rests with God himself. We'll be continuing our study of God's plumb line next week. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Greg Tidwell, and I appreciate your participation in this class.